Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today is one of our newest Emerging Civil War authors, Diana Dretske. And Diana, hello and welcome to the podcast and the vodcast in Emerging Civil War.
Thanks so much, Chris.
So, Diana is the author of the latest book from the Engaging the Civil War series, published in partnership with Southern Illinois University Press. The Bonds of War, a story, and I gotta be sure I'm not, see, I always vanish on the thing here, I'll hold it up. The Bonds of War, a story of immigrants and Esprit De Corps and Company C, 96th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. And this is a really, really neat book. And it started with a bit of photo sleuthing. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Diana?
That's right. Well, as my position as a curator at the Best Flower Done Museum, the photo tintype of 5 Union soldiers was coming off exhibit. And so part of the process is you assess its condition and prepare it to go back into archive storage. And when I looked up the object record, only one of the 5 men were identified, and it really made me kind of sad, actually. And I thought, you know what, this must be knowable somehow. So I decided I would see if I could identify the men and spend a little time with that. And I was able to do that utilizing some resources, the 96th Illinois Regimental History. Also used a little bit of photoshopping to layer images to see if men that were identified in the regimental history were these guys. And so eventually I identified them. But then that really took me on a whole other journey because, as you know, the more you find out about things, the more you want to know. So it just opened up a lot of questions for me. Yeah.
So now let me backtrack just briefly. Tell us a little bit about the museum you work for, so we have the opportunity to give them a little plug.
Nice. Yeah. Well, the Best Flower Done Museum has been around actually in different iterations since 1957. It started out as the first museum in Lake County, Illinois, a county history museum. And we recently relocated to Libertyville, Illinois, and actually changed our name. So we had been known as the Lake County Discovery Museum, and decided to change our name in honor of the first official historian of Lake County, Best Flower Done, who was very instrumental in collecting and preserving early Lake County history back at the turn of the century. So she's someone that I admire, and some of her collection is within the museum's collections. So that's who we are. So we do Lake County history.
So how did the picture of these 5 men wind up in the museum's collection?
Yeah, so back in 1962, so during the Civil War centennial, there were, as you know, a lot of events going on around the country. And the Lake County Museum at that time was also doing Civil War reenactments and things to celebrate the centennial. And a grandson of one of these men, so Edward Murray's grandson, Leland Simmons, had this beautiful encased tintype photograph of his grandfather with these 4 other men whom he was unable to identify. And he donated it to the museum, which is just really remarkable to me that you would actually donate something as precious and lovely as that. So all those years later, so that was 1962. So 2012 is when I came across this issue of only Edward Murray was identified. And so then was able to connect all those dots and find out that they were all immigrants from the British Isles. They had all settled in the same neighborhood along the State Line Road in Lake County. So they were neighbors, and they were farmers, and they worked together in the neighborhood and had some different connections depending on the church they went to and so on. So I started sort of building their social network and finding out all these connections about them.
One of the things that I think is neat about the book is you talk about how they're immigrants and they come from different parts of the British Isles, but each one has a pretty unique story that makes his individual journey pretty special. And yet as a collective, that story of this immigrant experience is in some ways very archetypal of the larger immigrant experience of the Civil War. So you've kind of got this very individualized personal story, but also this larger story that is very reflective of a lot of the experience of a lot of guys.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's right. And so Edward Murray for me is really the linchpin of this whole story because the photograph came from his family. He was the oldest one in the group. He was 34 when he enlisted. And he had actually been living in the United States for almost 30 years at that point. So he was, I think, 3 or 4 years old when his family immigrated from Scotland. And so, in a way, he probably looked at himself very much as an American and living on the frontier, but he held on to that Scottish heritage very much. He was, by the time of the Civil War, he actually had been elected to public office and he was very well respected. So that was one of the reasons why he was recruited, so that he could really be a person that the younger men could look up to. And so these other men that enlisted with him, for example, Laughlin Madden, he was Irish. All the other men were either English or Scottish and were Protestant. He was Irish Catholic. He had a very different view, as a lot of Irish Catholics did, about what was happening with secession and then the civil, all of these sectional politics, and really also wanted to make a name for himself as an American and sort of embrace that, but came at it from a different angle of wanting to do what was best for the Irish, for his family, for the betterment of them, but also possibly for that connection back to Ireland. I mean, the Irish really looked at this country, especially the Maddens, who immigrated during the famine. So they were famine Irish. They were running from death when they came here. And so they had that suffering on them. And so they really wanted to break free of that and do whatever they could in order to survive. And if the Union failed, they felt that their home, this new adopted home, was gone. So it was a refuge for them. So it's interesting. And then there was John Taylor, who was a very young Scottish lad who enlisted with Murray and the other guys. And he really looked at it as wanting to be considered an American citizen. So he enlisted to preserve the Union, but he wanted that service to mean something. So I'm here, I'm a teacher, I'm a farmer, but I'm not a citizen at this point. So he hoped that his military service would actually give him that right to be called an American citizen.
It's interesting that so many immigrants did look at the war as their chance to prove their Americanness. And of course, I've studied this most closely in Fredericksburg with the Irish Brigade, for instance, the experience of German Americans in the Union 11th Corps at Chancellorsville and on Gettysburg, and that trial by fire to prove that they're every bit as good as any other man who would stand up there. And that was a defining feature of their Americanness to them.
Yeah, definitely. And there was some pushback even locally here in Lake County against the Irish, and the feeling that they were really secessionists, and even if they enlisted in the Union Army, they wouldn't make good soldiers. They would end up being traitors or desert or some such. So so these men really wanted to embrace that whole ideal of what is America. It's freedom, it's liberty, it's this patriotism. We're going to fight for it. And these guys actually enlisted in a regiment that was not an ethnic regiment, which I think is interesting because there were a lot of them around. They could have, enlisted in the 1st Scotch Regiment, or Madden could have gone into the Irish Brigade out of Chicago. But they decided to go with the 96th, so stay in the community that was largely native born, but and work with these guys. And I think there was a comfort level there and a trust level there, and about integrating into this community. Everyone was sort of in it together on the frontier, building this new life here.
And that makes a lot of sense if you're trying to ground yourself with your identity. One way you can look at that is that ethnic connection that you mentioned, but also just like, these are the guys I live with and I work with, they're my neighbors, and I'm grounding myself in this sense of home, which becomes an important component of your book as you talk about that notion of esprit de corps. Tell me a little bit about your angle on that with the book.
Well, first of all, I looked at it from the point of view of the photograph. So what struck me most about this photograph, there's 5 guys in the photo together. It seems a little crowded, right? And then when I discovered they're not related, I think 2 of them are related like through marriage, I was just more and more intrigued about that. So it was this moment where they enlisted together and went together for a reason, but to me, it's like, okay, so really they have this strong bond. They're commemorating to take this photograph together. And that photograph was literally taken just a couple of weeks before they marched off into the Western Theater. So it's this small banded group of guys who have their own esprit de corps. They're bonding together. They're going off into this unknown. I mean, they had no idea what they were getting into. They just had the spirit of patriotism. And then through training with the 96th Illinois with these guys, and the 96, if you're not familiar, I think you are, but some folks may not be, is unusual because it was made up of companies from 2 different counties. Lake County supplied 4 companies, and Joe Daviess County, which is in the northwestern part of the state, supplied 6 companies so that they would get the 10 company allotment for the regiment. So they were coming together from disparate areas, over 150 miles or so apart, but yet they had the same vision and they bonded and they created an esprit de corps to work together to become a really good unit. And they trained a lot. They had a lot of time to train because they didn't actually do as much fighting as some other units. So that was part of how their esprit de corps grew.
So give us a quick rundown of the 96th for folks who are not familiar with the regiment. Where they end up going and what they end up doing.
Well, they're best known for being at the Battle of Chickamauga. So they were in Granger's Reserve Corps there, and they saw action on September 20th, 1863 at Chickamauga. They came to the aid of General Thomas, and their first big engagement was on Horseshoe Ridge, and had a couple of charges up the hill there at Horseshoe Ridge, and suffered a lot of casualties. They actually at Chickamauga had the 3rd highest rate of casualties of any of the regiments there. So although the regimental history says they had the highest, and I don't think that's unusual actually for veterans to be proud of their record and maybe to embellish it a little bit, because part of who you are and what you did was how many guys you lost, what you went through. So that's probably why they did that. They were also in the Tullahoma campaign. They were in the Atlanta campaign. They were at Kennesaw Mountain. They were also at Chattanooga and the Nashville campaign. So they're kind of all over the place. Most of the time they were building fortifications or guarding supply trains and such. So they were involved in some battles and some skirmishes. And the biggest one though would have been Chickamauga for sure.
Sure. And, it's one of those things that, like, oh, you want to get into the action, you want to be able to say you're in it. But then, like, let's be honest, nobody really wants to get shot at. So if you're kind of behind the line, it's not such a bad deal sometimes.
Right. Yeah. And because you see that in their letters, some of the sources that I looked at were actual letters that these guys wrote. And they actually talk about that. They're really tired of digging ditches and guarding trains and doing that kind of thing. But at the same time, because they wondered about the value of that. What is our worth if that's what we're doing? I mean, we're farmers, so I guess they think that we're good at digging holes or something. But in reality, they didn't think that they were really worth anything, that you had to fight, you had to be in a battle to have your worth. And fortunately for some of them, they got wounded, and it was very traumatic once they did get to that point.
Now, you've talked about three of the guys in the photo, but we've left out two. Do you have a second to just kind of brush them for us?
Oh, sure. So the other two men are James Murray, and he is Scottish born as well, and his family came over early. His immigration story is like a lot of families. I think you'll have one or two individuals who will immigrate and send back word, and I bought land and I'm farming and it's really great here, you should come. So James's father decided to uproot the family and bring them over. And so then they settled in that neighborhood there near the Murrays. In fact, James Murray's uncle John, who was the first one who came over, married Edward Murray's sister. So it's kind of how that works in small communities anyways. But so he was a Scottish lad, and he was about 10 years old when he came over. So he had really strong memories of being in Scotland, and always kept that throughout his life, and became a farmer. And then William Lewin was English, and his family came over, and he was actually kind of always interested in helping people. And he got into more like veterinary medicine in that. But it wouldn't be until after the war that he actually studied and got a license in veterinary medicine. And I feel that his sort of core value of wanting to help people really played out during the war, and really was actually ended up being part of the burden or guilt that he lived with after the war as a veteran. And we can talk more about that if you like. But because he would see people suffering. A good friend of his, Laughlin Madden, suffered at Andersonville, and Lewin tried to help him and get him food and such, but Madden didn't make it. And I do feel that Lewin felt guilt over that perhaps he could have done more. Maybe there was something different he could do. And so after the war, he became a doctor. He was a veterinarian doctor, but he also practiced on people because his neighbors trusted him so much. But interestingly, he was taken to court 3 times by medical doctors, basically a cease and desist. And interestingly, there were juries, and the juries did not agree. They said, no, we think he should continue what he's doing because he's providing a service at a time when there aren't a lot of doctors around. So right. just an interesting angle on his life.
So as these guys went through the war together, how did you see their esprit de corps develop over the course of their service together? Because that itself is part of the story.
Yes. Well, you do see, you do get glimpses of the camp life together, and the close proximity. Now, 4 of these 5 guys actually were tent mates during the war. John Taylor was not. His brother also enlisted, so he and his brother actually were tent mates with cousins and people they knew from another local community. But at the same time, there's evidence in John Taylor's letters that he kept a very close tie with Ed Murray and the other men, because they were in the same camp, obviously. There's a story about Taylor learning how to play the fiddle. Edward Murray was teaching him to play the fiddle. Somehow they found a fiddle, and And so he took lessons, so there's things like that. There's really lovely moments like that where they're connecting and bonding in their Scottishness, so to speak. So that's part of it, is just the closeness of camp life. Now, when you look at in the battles or in the thick of the war, for example, when they got to Chickamauga, they were all right in line with each other. Ed Murray was a sergeant in Company C. And so, he was making sure the guys were together and going in the charge and that. But Murray was wounded very quickly. And he was actually paralyzed by the bullet that hit him and lodged, the way it lodged, it paralyzed him. And William Lewin, who I was talking about, who cared so much about people, he actually came along and he tried to help Ed get off the field. But they were in the midst of the battle. And at the Battle of Chickamauga, just kind of the waves kind of went. The Confederates came in and the Union pushed them back. And then the Confederates, so it was happening right there with Ed Murray laying paralyzed. And they could see the rebel line coming, and Murray just said, Billy, just run. You can't lift me. He was basically a dead weight. And so again, here's poor William Lewin. So he had to leave him. So you can just imagine the guilt that he felt about that. And they didn't know that Murray survived, actually. It was quite a while. I think it was maybe 15 days or so before they even found out he was alive. So things like that, where they're coming together and they're trying to help each other, or they're trying to raise each other's spirits and such, were key moments that I found when I was doing this research.
So war ends, everyone has to go home. What do the survivors take back to Lake County with them?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a feeling that, there's people that want to get on with their lives. These guys obviously have a lot of emotional baggage that they're not able to really share unless they share it with their comrades. And they have disabilities. Edward Murray would never fully walk again. He would learn to walk a little bit with a cane, but it really disabled him from fully being the farmer that he had been. And Billy Lewin, who had been in Andersonville, his health was deteriorated forever from that. Plus, he had been wounded at Chickamauga as well, and that caused debilitating headaches for him the rest of his life. And James Murray also ended up with rheumatism and things of that nature from just the life of being out of doors and in those unsanitary conditions. So they came back with that, but they wanted to keep that Esprit De Corps, keep that regimental affiliation going. And so they started to have reunions as early as 1875. And in Lake County, they formed Soldiers and Sailors Association. So they would have yearly reunions. And then, of course, the Grand Army of the Republic happened. So then they had those chapters as well. So they came back, and the best they could, they lived their lives. They got married, they had families. Of course, Ed Murray was already married, but had more children. And just really did the best they could. Interestingly, though, also for Murray and Lewin, they also wrote their reminiscences of the war. And that was a key point for them to be able to tell those stories, especially for Lewin, because he was a prisoner of war. He really, as with many of those men, really had a sense for they needed to tell this story. And he credited getting through that experience because of his comrades. So he had a deep devotion to the men who helped him make it through. And of course, hung on to that guilt for the ones that he couldn't help.
And did they achieve, in your perspective, did they achieve what they had set out to do when they signed up? You know, they had
Hmm.
something to prove. Did they come home feeling as though they had proved it?
I believe they did. Everything that I read after they came back from their biographical sketches or their reminiscences was very positive. They share these traumas and everything they went through, but at the same time, they're saying how proud they were to fight for the Union, how proud they were of their regiment, and wanting to share that with people. And if there were any frustrations, it was probably more in feeling like people weren't recognizing that or were forgetting it a little quickly. And so they made a lot of efforts to preserve that or memorialize what they had done. And one of the ways they did that was the regimental history, which they published in 1887,
Mhm.
and which is still an amazing work. And then in 1899, they erected a Civil War monument to honor their dead, which was interesting because a lot of monuments honor those who served. But they didn't want that. They wanted the ones who died, to honor them. And yeah, and then of course the Chickamauga Park,
Right.
they got their monument there, although it wasn't placed where they wanted it to be placed, where they did their best work. So that was actually a disappointment for them. But yeah, so they kept telling their stories and kept hoping for people to remember and to hear it.
So once you sort of dove into this story with the identity of one person from this photo, it sounds like you had a fairly decent pool of documentary texts to work with as you're starting to piece together this story.
Yes, so it's interesting, because I've worked with the Best Flower Done Museum's collections for many years, and I find, a lot of times we're working on an exhibition or I'm helping a researcher or something. So my focus is very narrow on what that person wants. And you don't have a lot of time that you can spend on everything that you would want to. So for me, this was a project I did on my own time. I said, I can't be limited on the amount of time I can work on this. So I dug into it on the weekends and I took time off to do that. And so in the Best Flower Done Museum's collection are a couple of collections of letters that were key. One is the Minto family. So that's where there were letters written by or about Taylor, John Taylor, or it mentions Murray or Loon or any of those guys. Minto was actually a cousin of Taylor's. And so they also lived in a very close proximity to these guys and knew them. And the David Minto was also in the 96. And so those letters, when you look at it from a different point of view, suddenly you find all these little interesting keys that you didn't see before. And then there was also the Orson Young letters. He was also in the 96, although with a different company. And so I got perspectives there. Then I just started reaching out and looking around and found that the Taylor family had also donated letters to the Abraham Lincoln Museum and Library. And so I went down there to do research, and that was just mind-blowing. It was just this whole other angle, and it just kept snowballing that way. One thing led to another, and very quickly there was a lot of information, and I kind of didn't know what to do with all of it. And I know when I was working on the manuscript, Chris, with you and Sylvia and Brian, it was a little daunting because I just kept going huge and wanted to put everything in there, and I needed that guidance for tightening up and honing it down, because you can surprisingly find out a lot about people that you think nobody did know about these guys anymore. So it was a really amazing journey. And
Well, and I think from my point of view, when I first saw the manuscript, and I'll have you elaborate on this in a second, my first thought was like, do we need a company level history of any sort of regiment? That's a lot of detail about a company. And so the story that you ended up telling, is so much more than that, which is why I was like, oh, this is going to be a fantastic book, because it uses that very narrow company level perspective to be telling these larger stories and touching on these more universal themes. And so there's a great deal of what I think is resonance in this book to the larger Civil War story, but trying to, as you say, sort of narrow down your pool of information to find that story and find those resonances is a huge challenge.
mhm, it really was. And I found out that I'm a micro historian,
Okay.
which you should embrace. And it was exciting to me to really drill down and find that and be able to connect things on that company level and show that I- these guys that people had forgotten about who were immigrants and really they were just names on the muster roll actually have a lot to tell us. And their experiences and what they went through are really representative of a lot of immigrants and a lot of native born guys, and how they came together and how they worked as a regiment and as an army. And even in the post-war years, how things affected them and how they what they did impacted how people behaved and reacted to things. And so I just think it's remarkable to be able to tell the story from their point of view and have as much information where you can share their words and frame it for people to say, this is where they were, this is what was happening, and then here's what they were thinking about this, or their part of it is really pretty amazing. I don't know. I mean, of course, I came away loving them. You can't not get to know people that much and not get some sort of connection with them. But at the same time, I wanted to keep some distance so that I had a perspective of being a historian and trying to um, present it in such a way that people could also see that context and see where they fall into it and what they can tell us about what was going on the home front, who was supporting them, how did that help them while they were 1,000 miles away, and what was going on during the war, and how did that, what they told people at home, how did that impact them.
Now, this was your first book. What was it like to get that box of books showing up on your portfolio?
It was very surreal. I spent years looking at it on my computer screen. And even when the copy edits came and I saw the layout, it got exciting, but it still was on my computer screen. And when you actually see it and you open the box and you see it in your hands, you just, yeah, it just really have to shift gears on that. It was really remarkable moment. And then I read it a little bit. I was a little scared because you're just like, oh no, I hope I don't find a typo that I missed or something. But so far I haven't. So no, it was really exciting and it just turned out beautifully. I'm so happy with SIU Press was amazing to work with. You were amazing. Brian was amazing. It just was a great experience for me.
Good. Yeah, one of my superpowers is actually to find typos in my own books once they're published. Like I'll, just open it up and like, oh look, there, and it jumps right out and clobers me. It's a dreadful
Mhm.
feeling.
Yeah. There's always someone out there that will be happy to point them out to you
Oh,
also.
for sure, and they'll do it for free. They'll be glad to just tell you.
Yeah.
So probably too early to ask this, but what's next for you?
Yeah, I have thought about that. I don't know. There are a couple of things actually. One of the little nuggets in the book I talk about is that anti-slavery and abolitionist sentiment here in Lake County, Illinois, that started in the early 1840s. And I feel like that story hasn't been fully told. So that's something I might look into a little bit more, how to share that more fully. I think it's talked about a little bit here. I mean, I think people are a little bit aware of it. I know we are, of course, at the museum and in our exhibits, but oftentimes I think most people just think, oh, all Northerners were anti-slavery, and that's just sort of, the perception. But it's interesting when you can really tell the story based on people and what they were doing, and that there were actual hardcore abolitionists here.
Yeah.
So
Very good.
that may be something.
Definitely worth exploring, and I think that whole lead up to the war and the slavery issue is something that is, as you say, it tends to be overgeneralized,
Hmm.
and because it is so complex and it is so pivotal and it is so entwined with the road to war that
Hmm.
the better we can understand it, I think the better we'll all be. So, yeah. Well, Diana, thanks for spending some time chatting with me tonight.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So Diana's got some stuff coming up on the blog. You'll be able to see more of her writing there. And of course, the book is The Bonds of War from the Engaging the Civil War series. Diana, thanks so much. Best of luck. Congratulations. All that good stuff.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.